You'll tell me when to start, I take it?
Yes. We are just checking if we are live on YouTube. I think we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma, and I am excited, honored, delighted, nervous, and you can add all the kind of adjectives to this, but I'm very happy to host one of the best known experts on colonial history, one of the legends of our field of history, of our discipline of history, this evening on Karwan. And this is truly, truly an honor to host Professor Thomas Metcalf, joining us probably from Berkeley in America. This
Yes.
evening for us, this morning for him. It's quite early morning there in Berkeley. But today, I don't think it's fitting to give him an introduction because he's somebody who we all have read when we were trying to shape our understanding of the colonial history, the history of the Raj. He is currently serving as Professor Emeritus Sarah Khalid, Professor of Indian Studies and Professor of History at University of California, Berkeley, and he has made significant contributions to the field of colonial history. Among his notable works are Imperial Connections, India and the Indian Ocean Arena, 1860 to 1920, which came out in 2008, A Concise History of Modern India, which he co-authored with Barbara Metcalf, his wife, and whom we'll all see on the 17th of March here on Karwan, delivering the next Karwan Distinguished Lecture. Then Forging the Raj, Essays on British India and the Heyday of Empire, 2005. And among his best known works is Ideology of the Raj that came in 1997, alongside other publications which elucidate the complexities writing the history of the Raj in India and the world. Today, in this Karwan Distinguished Lecture, Professor Metcalf is going to talk about his long career as a historian who has written on the colonial history. The title of today's presentation, today's distinguished lecture is Writing the History of the Raj 1960 to 2020 or 24. And today he's going to give us insights from his own career, his own journey, along with Professor Christopher Bailey, one of his colleagues and probably friends in the same discipline of history. Thank you so much, Professor Metcalf, for agreeing to do this. It is truly an honor hosting you on Karwan. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. I've been asked by the organizers to talk briefly about the changing currents of the historiography of the Raj over the last half century. Not surprisingly, a large number of assumptions and ideological commitments have shaped Indian history writing. Among these, this is all right, it's loud enough.
Yeah,
Among
can you
these,
speak a little louder? I think we are unable to hear your voice.
oh,
You can speak a
sorry,
little louder.
a little louder. All
Yeah.
right. Not surprisingly, a large number of assumptions and ideological commitments have shaped Indian history writing. Among these, surely one would include, for starts, the old fashioned imperialist with its justification of empire, and the nationalist with its celebration of great heroes. I do not intend to discuss any of those, in part because by the time I came to intellectual maturity in the late 1950s, uh, they were all increasingly seen as constraining and unfashionable. One might even say there existed at that time, in the mid 1950s, only three influential scholars of India's history under the Raj in the whole world: Holden Ferber in the USA, Tapan Ray Chowdhury at Delhi University, and Percival Spear at Cambridge. Now, I would like to start with a few words about my own training. My starting point was as a history major at Amherst College, a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. There I wrote my bachelor honors thesis on the Victorian liberalism of William Gladstone. Why did I care about liberalism? Why choose this topic in the first place? Perhaps as an American and as a liberal myself, I wanted to see where the ideas of liberalism had come from. And then also, more especially in political terms, I wanted to see how America was in the 1950s, fast displacing Britain as the preeminent world power. For this purpose, it made sense for me to pursue British history and to do so, in fact, after graduation in Britain itself. Hence, I joined Cambridge, St. John's College, Cambridge, and was assigned Dr. Ronald Robinson as my supervisor. By chance, oddly, it may surprise you that the sometime Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was a classmate of mine at St. John's, Cambridge. The earlier studies of Victorian liberalism had paid little attention to the empire. Some even considered Victorian liberalism to be anti-imperial. This I regarded as, of course, absurd, as multiple conquests, all during the 1830s, 1840s, and 50s, made evident. Robinson, by contrast, was then engaged in an exciting revisionist study of the Victorian Empire, initially announced in a path-breaking article published while I was at Cambridge on the imperialism of free trade. The project took enduring shape with a classic 1961 volume entitled Africa and the Victorians. Hello, you still there? Lost the connection.
Yes, sir. We are still here. You can continue. Yeah.
Shall I continue anyway?
Yes.
Okay. In the classic volume, Africa and the Victorians. Captivated by Robinson, I decided to become an imperial historian myself. He suggested that instead of Africa, his research subject, I should study the Victorian Raj in India. And he further suggested, this is from my dissertation work, that I assess the ways a changing Victorian liberalism shaped British policy in India in the aftermath of the 1857 revolt. I told him I knew nothing about India or the Raj. I had never even heard of the 1857 revolt. Bear in mind, Indian history was not studied. I told him I knew nothing about India or the Raj and had never heard of the 1857 rising. Still, at Robinson's, good, you're back. Still, at Robinson's urging, during my years at Cambridge, I embarked on a study of the ideology of empire, comparable in some ways, but less exhaustive in its treatment than the contemporary work by Eric Stokes, English Utilitarians and India. That book I had not read, it was not published while I was still at Cambridge. I was also thinking about politics. I was also caught up during my year at Cambridge by the dramatic events of the Suez Crisis of 1956. I protested in the streets, and in that crisis, of course, as is well known, Britain and France invaded Egypt just to get the Suez Canal, only to be forced in humiliating fashion to withdraw by the United States. This episode quite clearly showed the effective end of Britain as an imperial power and the simultaneous rise of America as its successor. My own work, as I wrote in a letter home at the height of the crisis, was, quote, does throw light on the present situation. After completing my PhD at Harvard, I took up a post teaching British and Indian history at the University of Wisconsin. However, by the 1960s, when I first joined Wisconsin, the study of India was undergoing a wholesale transformation in both Britain and the United States. Above all, with the collapse of the empire, imperial history was fast to went out of favor. Americans were now required to know something about what they called the third world. For this, the lens of empire obviously did not suffice. Hence, scholars sought, by studying such topics as world social change and political mobilization, to make sense of the histories of former colonial societies from within and from below. In the United States, this new style of research, which informed work in the social sciences more generally, came to be known as area studies. You picked an area and you studied it. In the United States, South Asian studies were quickly caught up in and sustained by the post-Kennedy rise of America to world power. Many of us in those years benefited from language fellowships, research centers, and the like, and in fact still endure in many cases. In particular, there existed the PL 480 funds, the product of American aid to India during a 1960s famine. The Indian government repaid these loans, but with non-convertible rupees, which then piled up at the embassy and were then dispersed to scholars like myself who would conduct research in India. My position at Wisconsin was among the earliest casualties of this new scholarly turn. In 1960, Wisconsin's newly hired African historian, Philip D. Curtin, though himself schooled in imperial history, established a graduate training program called Comparative Tropical History. I might note my wife studied in that program. This program sought to comprehend the histories of Latin America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia under a single rubric that would enable these formerly colonized regions to be studied together and, most importantly, apart from Europe. Students were expected to master the history of one region, learn its language, and become knowledgeable in the others. To introduce his new appointment, Curtin had my appointment terminated in favor of a properly trained historian of India. That was ultimately Robert Frickenberg. I taught at Madison for only 1 year. This rise of area studies obviously left me scrambling to recreate myself as a fully fledged historian of India. From 1964, I undertook a new project on the landed elites of northern India in the colonial era. I took as my central concern the fate of the landed classes in the province of Oudh in the central Gangetic plain around Lucknow. The British annexation of this province in 1856 had very much provoked the uprising in Oudh as part of the Mutiny Revolt of 1857. In Oudh, I was almost universal support. The British responded after putting down the uprising by awarding the landed chiefs, known as talukdars, full property rights over their estates, confiscated 2 years before and now returned. The chiefs, in turn, reduced those on their estates, peasant agriculturalists, formerly foot soldiers in their Raja's battles, to tenants at will. What, I asked, did this transformation mean for the landlords, for their tenants? How did this contrast with the remainder of the United Provinces the next 50 years earlier, where the landlords had been largely dispossessed in favor of local village communities? This project, after a great deal of research, culminated in the publication in 1979 of my book, Land, Landlords, and the British Raj. This project gave me a certain credibility as I approached tenure in the Berkeley History Department, where I was now a junior scholar. Still, there remained the question of language. When I was a graduate student in the 1950s, modern Indian languages were not taught at either Cambridge or Harvard, at least not on a regular basis. As a result, neither I or my contemporaries of those years received the language and area training our successors, including my wife Barbara, as I mentioned, received in the new South Asian Studies departments. In the end, after a year's delay, while the department considered whether one could do Indian history through English language sources, unlike, say, China, I succeeded in securing a permanent position in Berkeley at 1968 as a historian of India. I was the first person ever hired as an historian of India on the regular Berkeley faculty, and I initiated its South Asian graduate program. My first student was the late and much lamented John Richards, who studied the Mughal Empire. In Indian history in Britain, the 1970s was the heyday of the Cambridge School. Cambridge was not what it was like when I had been there 15 years earlier. Contesting the then current nationalist historian, contesting the then current nationalist history built upon heroic figures such as Gandhi and the great deeds of his devoted followers, the Cambridge School insisted upon the importance in the nationalist movement of local level connections, factions, and patrons in sustaining the movement. As the school's founder, Anil Seal, put it in his introduction to a seminar volume, quote, on the unsteady basis of local squabbles for spoils rested the larger political systems of India. Even the Congress itself was largely built out of this rubble. The 1970s saw also the more general rise of social history within the historical profession, with its iconic practitioners, Natalie Davis, E.P. Thompson, and the Anald School, famous and excellent scholars. This history sought to bring ordinary people into the historical narrative in place of sweeping generalizations and a fixation on kings, battles, and prime ministers. Such works as Christopher Bailey's Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars, and my own Landlords, and the British Raj, which I mentioned, these two books assess the transformation of a colonial society from the bottom up, not exactly the bottom. They're not peasants, but merchants and landlords. But still, both works look at Indian actors in their local arenas. Both are products of the 1970s. It might be worthwhile just mentioning a little bit the work of Christopher Bailey, who died suddenly and most unexpectedly not too long ago. Chris was a decade younger than me, but we still shared much. We both had enduring ties to Cambridge, for myself as a student, and he as a teacher and a scholar. We both rejected the assumptions of the Cambridge School. And we both, for most of our careers, endeavored to encourage research into social history and the changes brought about in India by British rule. So let's move ahead to the 1980s. Saw another dramatic upheaval in the writing of colonial Indian history. Much of this was a product of the eruption onto the scene of the Subaltern Studies group. As is well known, it was a collective closely tied to its primary organizer, Ranajit Guha, and it insisted upon the autonomous resistance of subaltern classes to colonial rule. Despite their often provocative tone, and they were out to stir up trouble, that's for sure. Despite the often provocative tone, the subalternists, among other things, upended the way Indian history was perceived outside India by the larger profession. No longer an obscure corner of little interest except to specialists. India now is inspired by the subaltern studies work, helped shape the historiography of other places around the world, from Japan to Latin America. Its subalternist enthusiasts published about 11 volumes full of articles by the various members of the group. As I say, I was never invited to join this collective, and nor did its style of research, its provocative style of research, appeal to me. Chris Bailey also stayed aloof. In any case, something else was happening. That something was Edward Said's Orientalism, published in 1978. Empire, I discovered to my delight, actually, but to my delight, once again mattered in the history world. Said's contention that the Orient was an artifact of European knowledge forced scholars to examine the assumptions of the colonizers and of themselves. As Said argued, this so-called colonial knowledge was of critical importance in enabling colonial rulers to justify their conquest. They had knowledge they thought they knew about the society, so they justified their conquest with it, and the structures of government established as well. As this style of analysis grew in popularity during the 1980s, it triggered an entirely new academic discipline, that of post-colonial theory, with close ties to English literature departments. By 1990, there had emerged the rather odd alliance of the subalternate Ranajit Guha with a literary critic, Gayatri Spivak. I do not believe either Chris Bailey nor myself ever conceived of ourselves as post-colonial theorists. Yet the influence of Said was pervasive in our work into the 1990s. Said's insights, as I wrote in the introduction to my 1989 book, An Imperial Vision, assessing British colonial architecture in India, quote, stimulated and helped shape my study of the ways British created knowledge of and represented India and the Raj in their architecture. British buildings in India, that is to say, could be read as a kind of text in much the same way as literary and official documents. I much enjoyed researching this book, which took me to all kinds of places in India in search of Indo-Saracenic, quote unquote, buildings. Bailey's Information and Empire book appeared 7 years later in 1996. This volume endeavored to go beyond simply assessing the nature of colonial knowledge, the assumptions about India and the stereotypes that informed its construction, and sought to probe more deeply into the actual functioning of what he called, quote, the information order in the early 19th century. Bailey especially examines in this book the transition from the British use of indigenous informants, people whom they had to come to meet at the local princely courts, the transition from the use of indigenous informants in the early stages of conquest to constructing a knowledge system based on their own Saidian misunderstandings. This volume, one might argue, brings Said's insights into a scrutiny of local, close historical analysis. It is, in doing so, Bailey finds, quote, a wide variety of localized engagements between power and knowledge. Colonial discourse did not explain everything all at once. During the decade of the 1990s, moving along, his imperial history, dubbed now the new imperial history because it had challenged the old British history. The new imperial history took root with different topics and different subjects and different regions, previously unstudied in their connection to empire. It even, in fact, pushed aside conventional studies of Great Britain itself as standing alone as an independent power, apart from the larger world. there were volumes in which the empire, quote, came home. I have been reading lately a recent volume entitled Empire Land, which shows, as the author proclaims, quote, how imperialism has shaped modern Britain. The Saidian turn also provoked me to revisit my earlier work on liberalism and empire. In my contribution to the New Cambridge History, published about 1995, dissenting from those theorists who claim that liberalism was implicated with imperialism from the very beginning, I sought in my ideologies of the Raj to construct a liberalism that possessed its own integrity, combined with a critical analysis of its transformation in the decades after 1858, from a Macaulayite vision of an India remade in India and Britain's image to the creation of difference. In other words, I refuse to see only an enduring hypocrisy in which the ideals of liberalism were made to be no more than mere alibis of empire, to quote the title of one book. The ideologies of the Raj has been surprisingly successful, and even after 30 years is still widely consulted and makes me a little bit of money. Chris Bailey, at the same time, wrote his own account of liberalism and empire. While I asked how the British turned liberalism to account in the making of empire, Chris asked how Indians turned liberalism to their own account, how they used it to define an emerging nationality of their own. His Recovering Liberties traces the process of assimilation from Ram Mohan Roy, of course, the greatest person in this capacity, into the early 20th century, of course, with Jawaharlal Nehru. From the 1920s onward, the adaptability and tolerance associated with men like Nehru was increasingly pushed aside, as we shall see. From the millennial decade onward, historians have increasingly endeavored to widen their geographical horizons even further with a historiography that placed nations and empires both in larger comparative contexts. One exciting new approach has focused on oceanic rather than land-based linkages across the globe. Initially, this involved primarily study of the Atlantic world and the slave trade and so forth. But Indian Ocean studies have increasingly claimed their own space. My Imperial Connections, India in the Indian Ocean Arena, published about 2007, endeavored to examine how India became something of a center of a larger imperial web, extending from Singapore in the east to West Africa and even to East Africa, especially during the later 19th century, with laborers, soldiers, lawyers, and traders moving out from India, including Gandhi, of course, together with distinctive ideas about how law and governance should work in a colonial context, spreading out in the subcontinent. Sugata Bose's Distant Horizons, published the same year, shares much the same focus. Now we also have in this larger Indian Ocean world Sunil Amrit's evocative history of the migrations across the Bay of Bengal, together with Bailey and Tim Harper's two-volume study of what they call a connected crescent of land between Calcutta and Singapore during and after the Second World War. Well, to continue up to the end, in the last 10 years or so, the history of modern India has become highly politicized and caught up in political controversy. I have not personally contributed any new research to these debates. Of course, I have read them. And they affect all of us. And you, the listeners to this program, especially as research students of a new generation who have to deal with these conflicts and contradictions. Two of the attacks on the traditional history writing are from the left, on conventional historiography, seen as too tolerant of oppression. And one, that of India, is from the right, with its efforts at creating a Hindu past for India, and in the process downplaying the Muslim accomplishments, such as the Mughal Empire. As Britain, as I indicated above with the volume Empire Land, the endeavor has been to emphasize, perhaps even to exaggerate, the extent of ideas, imperial ideas and institutions and imports of various kinds in shaping British society and British opinion and British activity. Connected with this is the denigration of Victorian liberalism, which I already mentioned. Victorian liberalism is customarily seen as open and tolerant. And now it's being made into an alibi for empire, and its practitioners of the time are called hypocrites. To be sure, of course, most Victorian liberals were caught up in the empire. James Mill and John Stuart Mill and Lord Macaulay all were actually employed by the East India Company. They were definitely in the middle of the empire. But that does not make them by itself hypocrites. One can argue, and I've just reread Mill the other day, one can argue that they saw the empire not simply as a site for the ruling of inferior peoples or for the enrichment of Britain, both of which are often claimed, but instead as a necessary stage in the transformation of these peoples to freedom. India was, to quote Mill, quote, a set of leading strings charged with sweeping away obstacles to improvement, and so gradually training the people for self-government, a self-government, of course, that would be defined by their adoption of European laws and institutions. It's wonderful to read Macaulay and John Stuart Mill in this regard. Unfortunately, the upheaval of the 1857 revolt shattered this optimistic vision and inaugurated an era of authoritarianism. One thinks of James Stephen, an attitude of authoritarianism that much shaped a lot of British India policy in the latter half of the 19th century, from 1860 up to 1920. But the ideals of liberalism did not disappear altogether and can be found in such men as the Viceroy Lord Ripon. So nowadays, one thinks about this whole period, and one has to say, statues may be overturned. One should be aware of the imperial connections of these people. But the study of liberalism and empire does not and should not end. Let us keep thinking about what this means. That's too important. A similar historiography in American history focuses on slavery, and by extension, the treatment of blacks. A volume entitled the, quote, 1619 Project, actually supported by the New York Times of all places. The 1619 Project announced the shift from seeing America's history as shaped by 1776, the year of independence, shaping it instead an assertion that the first boatload of slaves on American shores in 1619 was the defining moment in the country's subsequent history. It's a very extraordinary and provocative argument. In this view, men such as Thomas Jefferson were no longer shining heroes of the constitutional era, but mere slaveholders. Jefferson even had a slave woman as his partner. A newspaper advertisement in the New York Times for the 1619 Project proclaimed, quote, to understand the present, we must clarify the past, unquote. To be sure, of course, we have to do that. We need the 1619 story, but we also need other stories that should claim attention. Much work remains to be done in American history, and if any Indian students should want to do that, I would give them a lot of enthusiasm. Now, the India story, well, it's similar but different. Obviously, it's different because the attack comes from the right. Scholars associated with the RSS and other agencies have sought to remake the country's history into one shape. I'm sure all of your students know this very well. Into one shaped by a tradition wholly Hindu in character. Liberals such as Nehru has been pushed aside, as has the entire Muslim contribution of India's past, which is quite amazing. One could say in some 15% of India's population has been written out of the story altogether. Now, this section, the Indian story part of the story, is particularly worrisome as it could lead to the crushing of open historical research and discourse, with curricular revisions, silencing of critics, and the like. To be sure, in the United States, the governor of Florida has attempted something similar to lots of mockery. But the power of the BJP in the central government and the whole structure of the Indian system at the present time make the stories of India's history at greater risk. Thankfully, senior scholars such as Ramala Thapar, to whom we all owe a great deal, have spoken out on these issues. Still, we cannot deny that the people who want to do Indian history nowadays have got challenges they have to overcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Metcalf, for that very interesting and important lecture. I hope I'm audible to you. I've just changed the microphone. I hope I'm audible. Great. The first question, Professor Metcalf, to you is, you have mentioned about, because your journey starts from 1960s and you have seen all the changes in the kind of history that has been written from the the later colonialist perspective to the emerging new perspectives, to the subalterns and the new, like you mentioned, I think Empire Land, the new book that came out last year, I believe, and the new decolonized history that is being attempted in the UK and the US. How do you see the process of decolonization? Is it still continuing? Are we still in the process of being decolonized?
The process of being decolonized, well, you see in places like India and the United States and Britain, that process in a political sense has long been completed. So what we're talking about is an historical situation, how you look back at, how you consider that period. Everybody knows that India was Britain's colony. Everybody knows the United States had slavery. And so the question is, how do you access the stories that are going with this? I cited, in the case of British liberalism, John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill, he is, and people like him are the kinds of people we have to study, as well as other people, if we want to get a larger picture of the same thing. And this is true very much. There's a lot of controversy in the United States over the importance of slavery, and the 1619 Project, which is a serious historical work, has also, of course, received a lot of critical appraisal. So we just got to keep on doing our job, really, and researching, writing, and teaching history.
You know, you mentioned Mill. In India, he is considered to be the father of modern history writing, who introduced this kind of history writing in India. But he was also the one who divided India into Hindu India, Muslim India, and Christian
Oh,
India.
sorry, who are you talking about? Nehru?
No, Mill, John Stuart Mill.
Oh, John Stuart Mill. Oh, Mill,
yes.
Yeah.
And the right wing here in India, the conservative thinkers here in India, go back to John Stuart Mill, saying that he correctly divided India between Hindu and Muslim India, and now we have to go back to that Hindu India. So in order to decolonize ourselves, we are kind of colonizing ourselves and getting back to that narrative. How do you see that as a scholar?
Well, I mean, one has to acknowledge, first of all, that the division of India into Hindu and Muslim was part of colonial discourse. This is how the British sought to think about India. That was obviously not a historical fact. It was certainly not an historical fact in Kerala, and certainly probably not in UP either. And so the question then is, what information can you bring forth to provide the historical contradictions, if you will? I mean, one can't say that Mill was wrong. Well, he was wrong at one level, but at another level, as I say, he was onto a good thing. And where there is a definite error, where people start saying we want to split it into Hindu and Muslim, how far back does that go? Who said this? Oh, to what extent and when was it picked up by Nehru and the Congress? I mean, the whole thing is a construction of the historical past, starting out, I don't know whether you will, we might still the James Millian view of India, and ending up in 1947. And that the other point is that these historical constructions can have a real and deep meaning. These are not just books. These are not just talked about. They have a real historical meaning, and you have to find out. You have to trace the development, say, of the idea of Hindu versus Muslim from its earliest colonial days up to now. I mean, this is still very much obviously a live subject.
And also the kind of history that was written in the Nehruvian age from 1947 till 1950s to the mid 60s. Did the right wing here in India questions the historians who were working during that time of your generation of certain bias that was laid, the bias of historians towards the liberal policies of Nehru while writing of history, and they just ignore, or they try to sideline the kind of histories that were written during the Nehruvian age. How do you see that? Because you were also working at that time. You wrote your first book in the 60s, in the 70s. How do you see that?
I have to admit that Nehru is a very compelling figure. He pulls people in. He seems so. I mean, but Nehru also was clearly a product of the divided area. He talked about Muslims in ways that made them separate and different, just as much as other people did. And you might say that he didn't believe in a Hindu state. Well, he didn't believe in a Hindu state, but he believed in a state in which Muslims were somehow a different kind of being. Let's put it at that. I mean, we're a long way here from the BJP, but we're not altogether free of it. No, not altogether free of it. And again, people should study Nehru closely, as I've studied John Stuart Mill, and find out what his liberalism was consisted of, how it worked, and so forth. And also, of course, there were lots of other people in the 1950s, especially in India, which I haven't talked about here at all, who were coming of age and asking questions like that. I mean, that's why the subaltern movement, I think, is so important in the course of the historiography.
And how do you assess the critiques of the subalterns that was placed upon the colonial writers?
Well, a lot of those people were, I can't figure out what makes a colonial writer tick at some level. The Anil Seal and that whole bunch of people were, others have a connection to the place. Maybe their grandfather was in the ICS or something. And people feel good about their home countries and the good things they have done. Americans certainly feel that way too. And you have to try to separate out these feelings, these connectedness feelings from historical analysis. You have to be open to I have to be open to the right-wing analysis or the slavery analysis, but they have to be open to me also. And I often feel that nowadays, with many people, certainly in India, but also in the US, you don't get that kind of mutual sympathy. I'm trying to understand each other. You get propagandists who are saying, this is the way it was, and it becomes extremely annoying because it is not true. This is the way it was. It does not exist. There's no such place. Everything has to be considered and assessed in terms of, all I'm saying is let's do our job. Beyond that, and avoid these hysterics and accusations and things of that sort. And, the Nehru era did a better job in the Indian context than many people, but it wasn't perfect. there were lots of things they left out or misconstrued, particularly in the Hindu-Muslim relationship.
In retrospect, if you have to think, how do you see the growth of a scholar in yourself from the first book that you wrote on Awadh, on northern India, the history of northern India, 1857, to the last book that you authored? How do you see the growth of a historian in yourself, and how did that shape your understanding of the empire of the Raj?
Well, that's what I just talked about. That's the paper, really. I mean, I tried to, in some level, I was shaped by historiographical trends current at the time I was writing. I mentioned the Said case in particular. But I mean, one was trying to figure out stuff. And sometimes you make a breakthrough of your own, and sometimes you develop what's going on as the conventional historiography of the time. I mean, in the case of my last book on the Indian Ocean, well, a lot of people had studied the Indian Ocean trading networks, but the Indian Ocean, that as I looked at it, was not a trading network. It was, of course, the trading was there, but it was a place of the spread of ideas and administrators and people. And so that I just tried to make India the center of the empire for a while and see what it looked like. I mean, there's other things there. India was not the center of the empire, in fact, of course, but the position it played, it had something to do with that. And so again, my main suggestion is you have to do with historiography of the time. It becomes hard otherwise. But always keep your eyes open to angles that are different, as my angle was on the Indian Ocean, because those angles exist as well and have to be put into the larger picture.
And we are now living in the post-truth world where, public opinions are taken as historical facts, and people can contest historians easily without reading their works, without questioning the historical sources. How do you see the role of a historian in such times of the post-truth world?
Well, the role of the historian now is so important and so central. When you have, I'm speaking now for my own country, the United States is ruthlessly divided into a sort of liberal and a very conservative wings. Now, how do you get people to talk across those barricades? I think the historian's job is to make an argument which is convincing, not just waving their arms around and saying the other people are, oppressive or something. You've got to understand. It's just hard work, and being a historian is not an easy thing to be. But we need historians. People have to understand their past effectively. In the Indian case, it's such an outrageous claim about being a Hindu state that's fairly easy to see where it's wrong. But even in the United States, you have to assess and be appreciative of, say, Black history. Well, nobody studied Black history for 100 years in this country, and now people sometimes feel that's the only thing that matters. But it is something that's important. And the history of a settler colonialism, that's another interesting topic, because the United States was built out of secular colonialism. The piece of land I'm sitting on right now is Indian native property. And so I think that also helps us understand why Americans are so, scholars are so anti-Israeli in the current war. They see Israel as a settler colonial state, not as a refuge for Jews from Nazism. That was something else a long time ago. And so you have to, I think settler colonialism is a very useful angle to discuss quite a lot. Actually, that's a subject which I really like having developed.
When you were researching for your first book on Awadh on 1857, what were the challenges that you faced? Because writing the history of revolution or the mutiny of 1857 also might have required you to go under the notion of history at that time, and especially go maybe across the archives, beyond the archives, things which were not archived in the British archives. How did you navigate through those bylanes of history?
Well, first of all, there were a lot of different opinions in the archives. The archives don't suggest just one. The classic opinion that it was a military revolt if you read the archives, you see it was not just a military revolt. I read lots of accounts by British district officers of how they fled their posts during their uprising. And I began to see that this was not just a mutiny. That was obvious. But what was it then? That's not so obvious. And that requires a lot of deep research and thinking about the subject. That was a huge event. So I don't really know how to answer the question except to say that you got to keep your eyes open. And I spent it's written out of the sources, I admit, but I spent a lot of time, a whole year each, in Lucknow and Allahabad, in which I researched in those local archives. I really felt both for the mutiny and then for the history of the Talukdars and later society. I got to a lot of stuff. Now, admittedly, I could have got a different line. I could have studied other archives had I known Urdu. I mean, which is the main language at the time. I said why I didn't know Urdu. My wife does know Urdu. She does all her research in Urdu. And it makes for a really original approach to Indian history. I can't do quite that with the British, but I do what I can to try to enlarge and shape the understanding of the past.
And how do you differentiate between the British archives and the Indian archives? What are the differences between the two institutes of archives?
Well, I mean, the British archives and the government of India archives are basically the same thing. They are just organized in slightly different fashion. But the time I spent at the National Archives in Delhi, I spent 2-3 years there. I would call that a British archive in a way. That's mainly stuff by and about British officials. Indian archives is a different matter. My wife studies archives in Baroda and other places, and Bhopal, and I could never. It's frustrating as hell because stuff is just in piles. It's all you go into some of these archives. My wife was working on the Begums of Bhopal. If you go into the Bhopal archives nowadays, nobody can help you. They don't even know Urdu, and that's what the language is used as Urdu. Stuff is piled in heaps. I mean, it's a big job. I mean, the European archives are tidy, but of course they're not comprehensive. They are reflecting a point of view, but at least we can figure them out, and it's very difficult. You have to work with published materials. And in the India case, our archival manuscripts are very difficult to. I mentioned to my student John Richards, who was studying Hyderabad, and he practically gave up. They went home because he couldn't figure out what the hell it was organized for. But then he wrote a good book, and it can be done if you work through the Indian archives. My wife has written half a dozen books, some of which are amazingly successful. So, you got to pick what you can do. And I didn't want to pick which I couldn't do because I don't know any language well, and not the Urdu especially. And she does. And she can do that, and I can't. I mean, you ever accept your limitations? But I can write well, and I have managed to have interesting ideas that I could bring to the conventional historiography. So I'm still here at Maiden. I'm turning 90 years old next month. So you get a vision back of the past. The past lives in me in some way. That's why I gave you this talk.
Actually, you just mentioned an interesting thing, limitations of a historian. Another thing that we must learn from your generation of historians is how to handle a critic. In times like ours, when a scholar is faced with difference of opinion, they rather take the back seat. But how do you see, how does a historian how should a historian respond to a critic? That is a question that we all need to understand.
Well, you get how does the historian respond to critiques of his work is the question, I guess. And I simply say you try to understand what the critic is trying to say that's lacking or wrong, and then you try to decide whether, in fact, the critique was right, which is sometimes the case, or misread or misunderstood you. And so then you would put forward your opinion again, but in a different language, so to speak. I'm afraid I can't say more than that, really. Simply keep your eyes open and your wits about you. And don't get caught up in these historical controversies. But you do have to get caught up in them because they matter. They matter to what people are going to be doing. It matters whether the Emperor Akbar, was a noble, great ruler or some kind of a Muslim. That matters a lot. And so the same holds true for Thomas Jefferson, for that matter. And so you have to be aware of the varied approaches that are really necessary in almost every case to get a fuller view. You just can't be authoritative. But you have to have some principles. You have to have some principles, but you have to apply them in a way which leaves you open to others still.
And how do you see the relevance of public history in the US or in India today, and how that public history domain is different from the academic history domain? And why should academicians now make their scholarship public facing, more public friendly?
Well, I think it's, as I say, the reason why academic historians should make their work more public friendly is precisely what I've just said. You want people to have a sympathy to understand the larger issues that are going on, and not just have a conviction of we're right. I mean, I think the historian, I'm particularly concerned nowadays with this politicization, as I say, of history. Historians used to be able to sit in a corner and write and amuse each other. Now we can't sit in a corner and write and amuse each other. We have to be able to be players. And there are historians who are not academics who do good work, and others who do work that's not quite so good, but at least has this Empire Land book. That's not an academic book, really, but it's a well thought through set of information and ideas. And public historians can make a great contribution. I enjoy reading as public historians, where I don't always read my academic friends. So we got to have both.
Yeah. You are an institution builder in some senses, having been established the Berkeley Indian Studies department, and making significant efforts towards establishing Indian studies and area studies as a discipline there in the US. How do you see the future of the empire studies and the study of the Raj happening in the next years to come?
Well, I see it. It's hard to say. I see the history of the Raj should be embedded in the imperial studies of Britain. That is one thing I see. Another thing is the history of the Raj should be embedded in studies of Hindu society or things of this sort. I mean, people should have a sense of what the larger past is, but as they work on the present one. So, I mean, I can't. I wish I could be more helpful, but I mean, you just have to be alert and awake, and the history of the Raj fits into various strategies. It also fits into comparative history. How does the British Empire differ from the French, or how does the settlement of Palestine differ from that of California? I mean, there are ways of thinking critically and historically, and I think comparative history would be one way to help in this respect.
And it is interesting that the ghost of the empire still looms over us these many decades later on.
Yeah. Well,
So,
the empire exists. The empire existed, and it's going to continue existing in people's minds. I mean, one of the things that I find quite interesting is the question: is it a good idea to tear down statues of imperialists? I mean, in the British case, the slave trader in Bristol, his statue was dumped in the river. I think, I mean, this has to do with the question of what does the public see, how is memory transmitted. And I like, for instance, the fact that in Delhi, the statues of all these folks, a lot of them at least, are aware up in the north. What is that, Raj Park or something? You want to keep them. That's your past. You want to understand it, but you don't need to blazon it about anymore. And now I feel that some of the same sort of thing is starting to happen with Gandhi statues, because his situation is now under some contestation. So again, you want to keep people alert, but you want to have them know. You can't pretend that the Raj didn't exist. You have to have a larger understanding. What did it mean? How did it work? How did it affect coal mining or anything? Any number of questions that matter in India are affected by the understanding of the Constitution itself, for God's sake. I mean, all of these things are. The United States, they make a fetish of the Constitution and then they interpret however they please at the Supreme Court. But I mean, that's what constitutions are for. It sets a standard. It sets something to refer to.
That's correct. I'm very, very thankful to you, Professor Metcalf, for taking out time this early morning to address the students here in India. If you would like to say something about Caravan in the end about this program, how did you like the program and how do you
Well,
think?
I would like to hear more about the program because I had never heard of its existence before, and yet I keep it's a program for up and coming historians, PhD students, right?
Yes.
I think that we should have an exchange program where people in the U.S. and in Britain who are studying this should work with and get to know the Indian people of it. I mean, because connections to Indian scholars have been always something which we felt was important. I always felt that the appeal for 80 money going only to Americans was too bad. I mean, the Indian historical training is good, and it obviously could be affected in American training too, by a little more contact, a little more exchange of ideas and people. Maybe you could send a couple of students to Berkeley every so often. I mean, I found going to Cambridge, England, a very stimulating experience. And I think students would benefit from these kinds of experiences. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate having a chance to talk. It made me think about issues which I don't really think about very much, like my own past, and then the growing and changing nature of Indian historiography, which keeps on growing, keeps on changing. Don't stop now. Keep going and see where you end. We end up 50 years from now. That would be interesting. But I am worried at the present moment about this politicization, but let us hope we can get past that. So thank you
don't
very
you
much.
think politicization of history has been going on for many, many years, and history is always political?
Well, at a certain level, assumptions about what you do and what you don't do are shaped by assumptions about history that you have not ever been studied, but have just been. I mean, American history, America was wonderful. We had, all this sort of thing. People just assumed that was the case, and they never thought, they didn't want to really at some level look at, say, slavery or the treatment of blacks. People, but so I don't know. The main thing, of course, is to just be more open-minded. I don't know what else I can say.
That's correct. But thank you so much, Fee. There's so much to learn from you, your career, your books, of course, which are recommended in Indian universities.
I appreciate your compliments because I don't know. Are these books readily available in India? I don't know. That's another question.
Yes, they are readily available.
Some of them have Indian editions. Yeah.
Yes, and we are taught from that. So that's why in the beginning, I said our ideas are shaped by books like yours, Ideology of the Raj being one of them, which I read during my bachelor's days in Delhi University.
Well, I do meet Indians. I meet Indians who are not historians who come for some other reason, who have a friend down the street or whatever. And they are aware of these kinds of issues, and some of them have read my works. The ideologies of the Raj is certainly the most accessible, certainly,
And a concise history of India, which you
and
and
the
Barbara.
concise is the one that we do jointly. That also is sold very well. That issue, that of course has a problem. It does not take sufficiently into account the rise of Hindu nationalism. The book stops in 2010 because we got tired of writing it at that point. And there was a Congress government in office. Well, there hasn't been a Congress government anywhere near in office in the subsequent decade. And so, the BJP comes up, and probably it'll go down in 20 years. Who knows? But I mean, this is the question of being alert. We were not alert enough when we wrote that book to the changing temper. We noticed it, but we were not enough alert. And that's same true if you're writing a history of anything, really. There are certain hidden aspects that people act on, which the scholars don't notice. I think this is a problem in all subjects that matter for the society, not just slavery and Muslims.
That's correct. And those who are watching us, we are going to host Professor Barbara D. Metcalf on the 17th of March this year at 9 p.m. Her talk is about princely independence and innovation in Nawab Shah Jahan Begum's Bhopal, her research on Bhopal. So we are very excited to host her to deliver.
So I'm going to check out now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. This was truly a wonderful occasion that we had the honor of hosting Professor Thomas Metcalf to deliver this Caravan distinguished lecture. The transcript of the lecture will be available on the Caravan's website later this month, which can be downloaded and circulated. It is important that we keep the discussion or the space for public discussion alive in India today, where we need such spaces for critical thinking. We are excited to host Professor Barbara Metcalf on 17th, and I hope that all of you will be there. Caravan, as you know, is a students-led independent collective where we have been trying for the last 4 years to improve the kind of public history that exists in India today, to make ourselves more critical and more curious about the past and question the past critically, which is the need of the hour today. And we are thankful to our audience and our friends for always supporting us. See you on the 17th at 9 p.m. for the next Caravan Distinguished Lecture. Keep reading, keep questioning, keep thinking. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times.